Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video. Today I have a different video, it's more educational. So today's video is 5 chess traps that you need to know, or tricks that could help you win games quickly or have a huge advantage in material. So the first trap that we're gonna get to is the bug defense. Usually people don't play the bug defense. Some people don't know how to play the bug defense, and it's unlikely to find someone to play the bug defense. So let's start the game. Of course, you play the defense as black. Let's take your opponent start with the move on to e4. Then we're gonna respond with the bug defense with the pawn to g5. This is the bug defense. And of course the computer doesn't like the bug defense against the king's opening, so the king's pawn opening. And of course your opponent is gonna see that, oh, you're playing the pawn on the king's side, so your opponent will try to take advantage of the center. They're gonna play the center game, playing the queen's pawn to d4. Then after that you just play pawn to g4, and of course you're giving away a pawn, but you're not really giving away a pawn, but you're giving away a pawn. So your opponent taking this pawn is not really bad, but it's bad if your opponent falls into the trap. So after opponent takes the pawn, you play pawn to the queen's pawn to g5, looking for that pawn exchange. Most beginners are gonna miss that the queen is being attacked. Probably your opponent will take the pawn if your opponent is weaker, and then gonna take the queen. Most beginners will miss that. So let's take your opponent doesn't miss that. They see that you are taking their queen, then they decide to move the queen to the h4 square. Then after that you take the pawn, and your opponent decides to take back with the queen. Then you attack the queen with the knight to f6. Now the queen decides to go back to the previous square. Then you just play rook to g8, occupying the free file or the open file. Then your opponent decides to play knight to f3. Then after that the trap has been completed. You just play rook to g4. Of course the only square for the queen is the h3 square, and then after that you just play rook to e4 with a check, and then of course you win the queen. So that's the bug defense. Let's win the queen. That's the bug defense trap. So usually it won't work most of the time because your opponent don't play the bug defense, but if your opponent plays in this sequence, that's how you know how to gain an advantage. And even if your opponent takes the queen back to the starting position or back to the white side, you only have a pawn disadvantage. It's not like you have a big piece disadvantage. It's only a pawn disadvantage, so you can still play the game and win it. So that was the first trap. So let's get into the second trap. So the second trap involves the Italian game, where I call it the Italian game trap. So now most people play the Italian game, so it's gonna be very easy for some people to memorize the trap. So without wasting any time, let's get into the trap. On this trap you start with the king's pawn opening. You play the Italian game, so we're gonna play the Italian game. You play pawn to e4, and your opponent decides to respond with the king's pawn to e5. Then you are playing the Italian game, of course. You play knight to f3. Then your opponent is gonna protect the pawn with knight to c6, the king's knight variation. This is the king's pawn opening, the king's knight variation. So you're gonna play bishop to c4. Now you have completed the Italian game. After that, your opponent then plays pawn to d6, increasing the protection on the king's pawn. Then after, you're just going to play knight to c3, protecting your king's pawn too. Then after, your opponent will play bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen, and then you just play pawn to h3. And if your opponent doesn't take the knight, most of the time your opponent don't take the knight, will just go back. But if your opponent takes the knight, you just take, and then the game continues. So I'm not really having the trap. So we're gonna go into the trap where your opponent doesn't take the knight. So your opponent doesn't take and then moves back. Usually opponent will think that you're gonna move on to g4 attacking the bishop, but instead of doing that, you're gonna sacrifice your queen. You're gonna give away your queen. I know it sounds crazy sacrificing your queen for nothing in this case, or for a knight. You're gonna sacrifice your queen by moving your knight that's protecting your queen or covering the attack by the bishop. You're gonna play knight to e5, and of course your opponent would want to take the queen. I will take the queen, but I won't take the queen because I know the trap. But most people in this position, they are going to take the queen because I'm saying not really most people. I mean players that are really low on the rating, so are in the beginner side than the advanced side. The advanced players they are going to see this position and then they're not gonna take the queen. But then your opponent decides to take the queen. Then after your opponent takes the queen, the game is just over. It's just mate in two. After that, you just play bishop to f7 with a check. Then the king is forced to move. Now we play knight to d5 with a checkmate. So that's the Italian game trap, and how to work through it. There are probably more variations that you could advance in this trap, but this is the simpler one, and most players will fall for. Not advanced, but you know what I mean. Most players will fall for. So this is the second trap. So now let's get into the third trap. Oh, before we get into the third trap, so let's go back and explain something. If your opponent decides to take the knight instead of taking the queen, if your opponent decides to take the knight with the knight, planning to take your bishop after you capture their own bishop, you let that happen. And after you capture the bishop, your opponent's gonna see these three bishops not really free. You're gonna play queen to b5 with a check, and then this is kind of a fork, and then you win your knight back. So that's another part that you need to know if your opponent doesn't take the queen instead. So you can still have an advantage on the game because you have a pawn advantage. So that's what I like about this trap. You still have an advantage even after your opponent doesn't accept the queen. So that's what I forgot to explain. Now let's get into the third trap. Now let's get into trap number 3. Now our opponent is the one playing as white and we're playing as black, and your opponent plays the Italian game. So let's play. Your opponent plays the Italian game, of course, and then you play the king's opening 2, pawn to e5. Then your opponent plays knight to f3. You play knight to c6, protecting your pawn. Then your opponent plays the Italian game. And then you play knight to f6, and then opponent in this position decide to play the fried liver check. So you play this fantastic move, capturing the pawn, and of course if your opponent captures back, you can just play pawn and then you win your piece back. So let's take your opponent doesn't capture the knight, and instead we go for this, attacking the pawn and going for this kind of a fork. So instead of thinking too hard, you're just gonna play queen to h4, threatening this checkmate. And for instance, your opponent plays pawn to g3, attacking the queen. You're just going to simply play knight to g3, capturing that pawn. And then if your opponent then decides to take the rook, you're just gonna simply play queen to e4 with a check. You don't capture the bishop, you play this move with a check, and of course the king cannot move, so either the queen or the bishop has to protect. So the opponent is not gonna sacrifice the queen for knight, so probably gonna use the bishop protecting the king. Then you just simply winning the knight with a check, and then after that the king cannot move, and you just play this simple checkmate. So this is I call it the fried liver trap. So it's not the fried liver trap, it's what I call it, the fried liver trap. So that's what the trap plays out. So let's go to the last trap. There are probably more traps, but I'm just gonna give you a few that you need to know, which are simple to play. So let's get into the last trap. Now let's get into the last trap. I call this trap the Ponziani traps. So we're gonna play as white again, We're gonna play the king's pawn opening to e4, and then opponent plays king's opening to e5. Then we play knight to f3. Opponent plays knight to c6. Then we're gonna play the Ponziani opening with pawn to c3. Then opponent gonna play knight to f6. So instead of protecting your king's pawn, you're gonna play pawn to d4. Probably opponent's gonna play the most common move, capturing the free pawn there. And then after that, you're just gonna play pawn to d5, attacking the knight, and the knight can go back to e7. And then after that, you're just gonna capture the pawn, and probably opponent's gonna take the knight with a pawn to d6. Then after that, you're simply gonna play bishop to b5 with a check. And then if your opponent plays pawn, of course, opponent's gonna play pawn to c6, attacking your bishop. You're simply gonna capture with your pawn, and opponent's gonna capture back. Then you're gonna capture with the knight. And if your opponent in this position captures with the knight, which is the most common move, you're just gonna simply capture with the bishop with the check with this triple fork. And then after your opponent protects, you'll play the best move and capture the knight. Of course, capturing the knight is the best move. So if your opponent doesn't capture the knight and some way finds the move queen to b6, threatening checkmate, you're simply gonna play, and also threatening to capture the bishop, you're simply gonna play queen to e2, protecting the bishop and also protecting the checkmate at the same time. And then after that, your opponent's probably gonna play knight to c6. Then after that, you're just gonna play queen to e4 with a check and a fork. And then your opponent's gonna maybe play bishop to e7. Doesn't matter which bishop protects, you're still winning the knight. And then playing bishop to e7, and just gonna play bishop to c6 with a check, and then you're winning yourself a rook. So that's the Ponziani trap, and that's how you win yourself a rook, and you have an advantage at the game. So there's no way you could lose this if you could play this trap. So that's all the traps that I could cover. There are more traps that you could learn. So these are the few traps that you actually need to know in order to beat your friends and improve your game. So I think that's it from me. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and till we see each other in the next video. Bye bye.